The city woke up muggy, but something on that day seemed denser than the heat. A child was pushing their cart through the streets, as if carrying the weight of the world on their back. Across the sidewalk, an old trained dog sensed that something was wrong, and didn't take its eyes off her. That's when destiny collided with the truth in the middle of the asphalt, beginning a story that no one else could ignore. The sun had not yet completed its climb into the Oakstead sky when Lucy was already on the street, pulling a cart that seemed bigger than she was. She was a small girl, 10 years old, with messy braids and eyes that met no one's. Her bare feet knew every pothole in the cracked asphalt of the White Ridge neighborhood, every loose stone, every shard of glass hidden in the weeds. She also knew the weight of the life she carried on her narrow shoulders, a life she had not chosen but which had been imposed upon her as if it were her natural destiny. The cart was a collage of survival, scraps of old wood, bent axles from abandoned shopping carts, squeaking bicycle wheels, and ropes that threatened to unravel at any moment. Inside, plastic bags overflowed with crushed cans, empty bottles, cardboard soaked by the previous night's rain, and pieces of scrap iron that cut her small hands when there wasn't enough care. And there was rarely time for care. There was rarely time for anything other than working, walking, collecting, returning, and starting over. The houses of White Ridge were squeezed together like crooked teeth in a tired mouth, unpainted walls, rusty gates, colorful clothes hanging on lines that crisscrossed tight backyards. From some windows, curious eyes followed the girl, some with pity, others with indifference, all with that safe distance of those who preferred not to get involved. After all, everyone had their own problems, their own silent battles, and Lucy had learned from a very young age that no one was coming to save her. No one ever came. Across the street, in a house that still held some trace of better days, Arthur watched everything from his porch. He was 68, his body stooped by time and a sore back from a life spent bent over woodworking benches. His rough, stained and calloused hands now held only a cup of reheated coffee. The workshop out back had been closed for months, ever since the will to create anything had dried up, along with the tears he had shed over Madeleine's coffin. Madeleine. The name still hurt like a splinter embedded in his chest. His wife of 42 years, the one who laughed too loud at summer festivals, who sang while she cooked, who called him a stubborn old man with so much affection that the stubbornness became a compliment. She had been gone for 1 year and 3 months. The doctors said her heart had simply grown tired of beating, as if hearts had a right to exhaustion, as if they could choose when to stop. Arthur didn't accept that explanation. To him, Madeleine had decided to leave because she knew he could carry on alone. She had always known more about him than he knew about himself. Now the house smelled of silence and accumulated dust. Raphael, his only son, called every day from Kingsport, insisting that his father move closer to him, and his young granddaughter. He said that Oakstead held only ghosts, that the house was too big for one man alone, that loneliness was bad for the mind. Arthur always refused with the same phrase, "It's not time yet," but not even he knew when it would be. Arthur's routine was as simple and repetitive as the ticking of the wall clock. He would wake at 5, make coffee, water the plants that Madeleine had loved so much, and that now survived more out of stubbornness than care. Then he would sit on the porch with an old magazine or some broken object he pretended to fix just to have something in his hands, and he would watch. He watched the street, the neighbors, the life that continued, indifferent to his pain. That's how he began to notice Lucy, not all at once, but gradually, like someone noticing a crack in a wall that widens day by day. The girl always passed at the same time, pulling that cart that was too heavy for her size. At first, Arthur thought she was just a child helping her family, a common thing in a neighborhood where everyone did what they could to survive. But there was something different about her, something that bothered him. Maybe it was the way she lowered her head when someone greeted her, or how her hands trembled as she tried to balance a stack of cardboard. Maybe it was the bruises that appeared and disappeared on her thin arms, always with new explanations murmured in a low voice. Or maybe it was simply the fact that she never smiled. Never. A 10-year-old child who didn't smile was like a bird that didn't sing. Something essentially wrong with the world. Arthur didn't know what to do with the discomfort growing in his chest. "It's not my business," he repeated to himself. "Everyone has their own problems." But the phrase sounded empty, unconvincing, like a lie someone tells so many times they almost start to believe it. The real change began with Thor. The Belgian Malinois had arrived 4 months ago, brought by Raphael on one of those bi-weekly visits where the son tried to convince the father that life was still worth living. Thor was a retired state police dog, trained to sniff out drugs and protect officers on dangerous operations. At 9 years old, hip dysplasia had forced him into early retirement. Raphael had met the sergeant in charge of the kennel, and knowing his father's loneliness, thought a dog might make a difference. Arthur had resisted, of course. He argued he was too old to care for an animal, that he didn't have the patience, that a big dog was a lot of work. But Raphael insisted, and Thor stayed. At first, the two observed each other from a distance, like two war widows trying to figure out if there was still room for companionship. The dog slept in the yard, ate his food in silence, and never barked without reason. He was disciplined, calm, almost human in the way he seemed to understand that the house was still in mourning. Over time, a kind of silent friendship was established. Arthur began talking to Thor while watering the plants, telling stories about Madeline that no one else wanted to hear. The dog would listen with those attentive eyes, his pointed ears twitching at every inflection of Arthur's voice. He never interrupted, never judged. He was just there, a solid, comforting presence in a world that seemed increasingly empty. And then Thor started reacting to Lucy. The first time was on a Tuesday morning. Arthur was on the porch when he saw the girl pass, dragging her cart with difficulty. Thor, who was lying beside him, suddenly stood up. His ears perked up. His whole body went rigid, muscles tense beneath his dark coat. He walked to the gate, focused, as if he had detected something invisible to human eyes. A low, almost inaudible growl escaped his throat. Arthur found it strange. Thor never reacted to ordinary pedestrians. His training had made him selective, able to distinguish real threats from everyday movements. But there he was, clearly disturbed by something related to that fragile girl. In the following days, the scene repeated itself. Whenever Lucy passed, Thor would become agitated. He would pace back and forth, sniff the air, and fix his gaze in her direction as if trying to communicate something urgent. Arthur tried to calm him, to distract him with food or commands, but the dog remained restless until the girl disappeared down the street. That's when Arthur started paying closer attention, not just to the girl but to the context around her. He observed that she always carried too much weight for her size, that she sweated excessively even on the coolest mornings, that she would stop now and then to take a deep breath, as if the air wasn't reaching her lungs properly, and that when something fell from the cart, she didn't ask for help, just struggled alone to pick it up, push, and move on. On a stuffy Thursday, when the sun was already punishing the asphalt, Arthur saw something that made him clench his fists on the rocking chair. Lucy was trying to balance a stack of cardboard when a loose piece of wood from the cart fell and hit her shin. The impact was hard enough to make her stumble, but she didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, picked up the piece of wood, and continued. As if pain were so common, it didn't deserve acknowledgement. Thor barked. It was a sharp, insistent, almost desperate bark. Arthur looked at the dog and saw in those amber eyes an urgency that could not be ignored. It was as if Thor were saying, "Are you seeing this? Do you see what I see?" That afternoon, Arthur spoke with Mrs. Gladys, the neighbor, who lived 3 houses down. She was a woman in her late 60s, thin as a dry twig, but with a sharp tongue and an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business. If something was happening in the neighborhood, Gladys knew about it. He found the woman hanging clothes on the line when Arthur approached, with the excuse of borrowing some salt. She saw through the lie immediately, but said nothing. She just gave a wry smile and offered him a cup of coffee on her porch. It was there, between sips of weak coffee and the buzzing of flies, that Arthur asked about the girl with the cart. Gladys sighed deeply, as if preparing to tell an unpleasant story. "That one's Lucy," she said, shaking her head with a mixture of pity and resignation. "Lives with Al, about 3 blocks from here. They say he's her uncle, but nobody really knows. The girl's mother, from what I hear, had serious mental health problems and ended up in an institution about 2 years ago. Since then, Al took custody, or at least that's what he says. "And what's this Al like?" Arthur asked, trying to sound casual. Gladys grimaced. "He's no saint. I'll tell you that. A scrap collector, spends his days on the street, has a reputation for drinking too much on weekends and having a short temper. I've heard yelling from his house a few times, but you know how it is? Everyone has their own problems. Nobody likes to meddle in other people's lives." Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. That phrase again. Everyone has their own problems. As if it were possible to ignore a child's suffering just because it wasn't happening inside your own home. He walked back home pensive with Thor by his side. The dog seemed to sense his owner's unease and walked close to his leg, as animals do when they feel something is wrong. That night, Arthur barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rustle the trees outside and thinking of Madeleine. What would she do in a situation like this? Madeleine could never see someone suffering without trying to help. Whether it was a sick neighbor, a hungry child, or an abandoned animal, she always found a way to be present. Arthur used to complain that she worried too much about others and not enough about herself. Now alone in that empty bed, he understood that was precisely her beauty. The ability to care even when it hurt. Did he still have that inside him? Or had the pain of loss consumed his humanity as well? The next morning, when Lucy passed by again, Arthur was on the porch with Thor. The dog tensed immediately, but this time Arthur paid attention to every detail. He noticed the girl was wearing the same clothes as 2 days ago, dirty and torn at the sleeve. That her hands were wrapped in old cloths, likely covering wounds. That she limped slightly on her left side. And that when a woman crossed the street and asked if she was okay, Lucy just lowered her head and mumbled, yes, she was fine. She had tripped on the stairs at home. The stairs. Always the stairs. Always a ready, well-rehearsed excuse, convincing enough that no one would ask more questions. Thor began to dig at the ground near the gate, anxious. It was a behavior Arthur hadn't seen since the dog arrived. It was the work instinct returning, that urgent need to act, to fulfill the mission he had been trained for his entire life, to protect those in danger. It was then that Arthur made a decision. He didn't know exactly what he would do or how, but he knew he couldn't just keep watching. He had to do something, even if it was small, even if it was insufficient. He had to try. He went inside and called Raphael. The phone rang 3 times before his son answered, his voice still sleepy from just waking up. "Dad, is everything okay? It's early." "It is," Arthur replied. "I just wanted to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Raphael knew his father well enough to know that spontaneous conversations were not his style. "About what, Dad?" Arthur took a deep breath. "Do you still have contact with that friend of yours who works at the courthouse, the public defender?" "I do." "Why?" Arthur told him. He told him about Lucy, about the bruises, about the repeated excuses, about Thor's reaction. Raphael listened in silence, asking pointed questions, taking notes. When Arthur finished, his son was quiet for a few seconds. "Dad, you know this is delicate, right? We can't just accuse someone without proof. If we're not careful, it could make the situation worse for the girl." "I know, but I can't pretend I haven't seen anything either." Raphael sighed. "Let me talk to Dr. Fisher. He'll know what to do. In the meantime, keep observing, but don't get directly involved, promise?" "I promise." It was a lie. Arthur knew he couldn't just stand by and watch, but it was what Raphael needed to hear. The days passed slowly, each one dragging the weight of its own tension. Arthur remained on his porch every morning and Thor remained restless. Lucy continued to pass with her cart, more stooped, more tired, more faded each day, until on a Friday afternoon everything changed. Arthur was fixing an old chair on the porch when he heard desperate barks coming from the street. They weren't ordinary barks. They were canine screams, urgent, frantic. He dropped everything and ran to the gate. The scene he found made his heart race. The cart was overturned in the middle of the street, spilling cans and cardboard everywhere, and beside it, lying on the hot asphalt, was Lucy, motionless, unconscious. Thor was standing over her, protecting her small body with his own, growling at anyone who tried to get close. A tall, thin man in a dirty shirt and an unkempt beard was shouting from across the street. It was Al. He was yelling that this was absurd, that it was just a fainting spell, that the girl was weak, had always been weak, that the dog was dangerous and should be restrained. But Arthur wasn't listening. He ran to Lucy, knelt beside Thor, and touched the girl's face. It was hot, too hot. Her skin was pale, her lips chapped, her hands trembling even in unconsciousness. Severe dehydration probably combined with extreme exhaustion. Thor looked at Arthur, and for the first time since he'd arrived seemed to relax, as if to say, finally, someone did something. Arthur picked Lucy up in his arms. She was too light, too fragile, too small to carry the weight she had been carrying. Al kept shouting, but Arthur ignored him completely. He turned his back and walked toward his house with Thor at his side, still on alert, still protecting. Mrs. Gladys appeared at her door, startled. "Arthur, what are you doing?" "What should have been done a long time ago," he replied, without breaking his stride. Inside the house, he placed Lucy on the sofa, covered her with a light blanket and wet a cloth to cool her face. Thor lay on the floor beside her, his head on his front paws, his eyes fixed on the girl as if he were standing guard. It was in that moment, seeing that vulnerable child breathing with difficulty on his sofa, protected by a dog that recognized danger where humans pretended not to see, that Arthur understood something fundamental. Life hadn't ended when Madeline left. It had just changed form. And maybe, just maybe, there was still purpose in his tired days. Maybe he could make a difference. Maybe there was still time to be who Madeline had always believed he was, someone capable of choosing courage over indifference. He picked up the phone and called Raphael again. "Son, I need you to come. Now. And bring Dr. Fisher. We have a lot of work to do." On the other end of the line, Raphael understood the urgency in his father's voice. Something had changed. Something had begun. And there was no turning back. While he waited, Arthur sat beside Lucy and held her small, fragile hand. She was still asleep, her face finally relaxed, without fear, without tension. Thor was calmer too. The mission wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. Outside, the Oakstead sun continued its relentless blaze. But inside that house that had for so long smelled only of absence, something new was beginning to bloom. It was still small, fragile as a newly planted seed, but it was hope. Raphael arrived 2 hours later, driving faster than the speed limit on the highways connecting Kingsport to Oakstead. Beside him in the passenger seat was Dr. Mark Fisher, a public defender in his early 40s with premature grey hair and the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much injustice to hold any illusions about the system. He and Raphael had been university roommates, sharing noisy apartments and idealistic dreams of changing the world. Over time, Raphael had gone into corporate law while Mark remained in the trenches of the public defender's office, fighting battles that rarely made headlines but changed lives one by one. When they entered the house, they found Arthur sitting in the chair beside the sofa, still holding Lucy's hand. The girl was sleeping, deeply, her breathing finally steady, her face relaxed for the first time in who knew how long. Thor remained on the floor, vigilant, but allowed Raphael and Mark to approach. The dog recognized Raphael immediately, and as for Mark, he seemed to have assessed his body language and concluded he was not a threat. Raphael hugged his father in silence, a tight embrace that said more than 1,000 words. Arthur felt his eyes burn. It had been so long since he had received a real hug, so long since he had allowed himself to feel that he wasn't completely alone. Dr. Fisher examined Lucy carefully without waking her. He noted the bruises in different stages of healing, the rope marks on her wrists, the small burns on the backs of her hands. He mentally catalogued everything, his face grave. When he finished, he asked everyone to go to the kitchen to talk. There, around the table where Madeline used to bake cornmeal cakes on Sundays, the three men discussed the situation. Mark got straight to the point. The law was clear on child abuse and neglect, but it was also full of bureaucracy and procedural traps. Without solid evidence, it would come down to one person's word against another's. Al could claim the injuries were accidents, that the girl was clumsy, that he was caring for her as best he could, and without concrete proof, Child Protective Services would have a hard time taking definitive action. "But we have to do something," Arthur insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't send her back to that man. I can't." "And we won't," Raphael assured him, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "But we need to be strategic. We need to build a solid case." Mark nodded in agreement. He suggested that Lucy stay in Arthur's care while they gathered evidence. Formalizing temporary custody would take a few days, but he could argue a medical emergency. In the meantime, they needed to document everything, take photos of the injuries, talk to any neighbors willing to testify, and check for prior records with CPS and the police department. Raphael had an idea. He worked in business law, but he had colleagues who specialized in family law. One of them, Beatrice Moore, was known for her work in custody and child protection cases. He would call her, explain the situation, and ask for guidance. It was then that Thor began to act strangely again. He stood up suddenly, walked to the back door, and began scratching at the wood, sniffing intently. Arthur followed him, intrigued. The dog looked at him with that urgent expression, then went back to scratching the door. "What is it, boy?" Arthur asked, opening the door. Thor shot into the backyard and went straight to the fence that separated Arthur's property from the abandoned house next door. He began to dig furiously, flinging dirt behind him with his back paws. Arthur called Raphael and Mark, who came, running. The three of them watched as the dog dug deeper and deeper, completely focused until his front paws hit something solid. It was a piece of fabric. Thor pulled it out with his teeth and brought it to Arthur. It was a child's t-shirt, too small to be Lucy's, caked in dirt and torn in several places. It had dark stains that could have been old blood, but it was hard to be sure. Mark took the fabric carefully, using a cloth to avoid contaminating potential evidence. His eyes met Raphael's and a grim understanding passed between them. This wasn't normal. Children didn't bury clothes in their neighbors' yards. This had been hidden, and things are hidden when someone has something to fear. Thor went back to digging. This time, he found more items: a child's shoe, a doll with a ripped-off arm, and pieces of paper rolled up inside a plastic bag. When Mark carefully opened the bag, he found several notes written in a child's hand. The handwriting was shaky, full of spelling errors, but the message was clear. One read, "Help me please, it hurts so much." Another, "I can't take it anymore, I want my mommy." And a third, stained and almost illegible, "If I disappear, look in the uncle's house." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Raphael closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Mark clenched his fists. Arthur felt his legs weaken and had to lean against the fence. This changed everything. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or vague concerns. These notes were cries for help, tangible proof that a child was in grave danger. And the mention of other children, implied by the different-sized clothes, opened up even more terrifying possibilities. Mark immediately picked up his phone. He called a contact at the Oakstead Police Department, explaining the situation in urgent, technical terms. Half an hour later, 2 patrol cars were parked in front of Arthur's house. Uniformed officers, accompanied by a social worker from CPS, listened to their accounts, examined the evidence Thor had unearthed, and meticulously photographed everything. Meanwhile, Lucy woke up. Her eyes opened slowly, confused, trying to understand where she was. When she saw the unfamiliar faces, she panicked. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't obey. Thor went to her immediately, resting his head on her lap, calming her. With his solid presence, Arthur also approached, speaking softly in the gentlest voice he could muster. "It's okay, little one. You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." Lucy looked at him with those enormous eyes, full of fear and suspicion. But there was something else too, something she might not have been able to name herself. A tiny spark of hope. As if, for the first time in a long time, a part of her believed that maybe, just maybe, someone actually cared. The social worker, a woman named Carmen in her 50s with her hair in thay bun and red-framed glasses, sat beside Lucy. She spoke to her in a low voice, asking simple questions, not pushing. Lucy answered in monosyllables, always looking at Thor as if the dog were her emotional translator, her anchor of security. It was Carmen who finally got Lucy to talk a little about her situation. It wasn't easy. The girl was afraid. Afraid of what Al would do if he found out she had told. Afraid of being taken somewhere worse. Afraid of never seeing her mother again, who was in a psychiatric hospital in Kingsport and whom she hadn't visited in over a year. But slowly, with Carmen's patience, Thor's comforting presence and Arthur's gentle gaze, fragments of her story were revealed. Lucy explained that her mother, Simone, had started having episodes when she was 8. Hallucinations, paranoid spells, moments when she didn't recognize her own daughter. They tried treatment at home, but the situation worsened until a neighbor called social services. Simone was committed involuntarily, and Lucy, with no other known relatives, ended up in the care of Al, who had presented himself as her maternal uncle. At first, Lucy said, he wasn't so bad, just neglectful. He would leave her alone for long periods, forget to buy food, and didn't care whether she went to school or not. But then, when he realized he could use her to collect more recyclable materials and increase his income, things changed. The demands increased. The punishments for not bringing back enough material began, and Lucy learned it was better to be quiet, work hard, and not complain. When Carmen asked about the buried notes, Lucy turned pale. She said she didn't know anything about them, but her eyes said otherwise. She knew and was afraid to speak. Carmen didn't press. She knew that traumatized children needed time, trust, and safety before revealing their deepest secrets. But the social worker also knew that those notes hadn't been written by Lucy. The handwriting was different, even more childlike. There were other children involved, and that made the situation even more urgent. The police went to Al's house. He wasn't there. Neighbors said he usually spent his afternoons at the junkyard on the other side of town, selling the materials he collected. The officers decided to wait for him, but they also conducted an external inspection of the property. The yard was a chaotic repository of recyclable junk, broken furniture, and rubble. The house itself appeared to be in poor condition, with cracked windows and moldy walls. Meanwhile, at Arthur's house, the afternoon passed in a climate of tension mixed with unexpected tenderness. Raphael made soup for Lucy, who ate slowly as if she weren't used to hot food. Arthur made up the bed in what used to be Raphael's room, putting clean sheets on it and opening the curtains to let the sun in. Thor never left the girl's side, following her every move, lying at her feet when she sat down, accompanying her to the bathroom and waiting patiently at the door. That evening, when Lucy finally went to sleep, Arthur sat on the porch with Raphael and Mark. The three of them drank strong coffee, processing everything that had happened on that impossible day. "Dad," Raphael began hesitantly, "you understand this is going to change your life, right? If you're granted temporary custody, you'll be responsible for a child. It's a big commitment." Arthur looked at his son with tired but determined eyes. "Your mother would have done this without a second thought, and I should have done it sooner. I'm not letting that girl go back to that place." Raphael smiled, his eyes welling up. It was the first time in months he had seen his father truly present, truly alive. The pain of losing Madeleine was still there. It always would be. But now there was something else. There was purpose. Mark intervened, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. He explained that the process would be complex. There would be hearings, psychological evaluations, visits from CPS. Al would have the right to a defense. He could contest the removal of custody. And there was the issue of the biological mother, Simone. Even while institutionalized, she was still legally responsible for the girl. It would be necessary to seek information about her health status, the possibility of recovery, and her wishes regarding her daughter's future. All of this would take time, weeks, maybe months, and during that period, Lucy would need stability, therapy, education. She would need to relearn what it was to be a child. She would need to discover that the world wasn't always a cruel place. "I'll do whatever it takes," Arthur affirmed, with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I'm not doing this because I think I'm a hero. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and because I've finally found a reason to wake up in the morning." The three men sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. Inside, in the room that was now hers, Lucy couldn't sleep. She was lying in the most comfortable bed she had ever felt, covered by a sheet that smelled of laundry detergent and sunshine, listening to the nocturnal sounds of a quiet house. Thor was asleep on the floor beside the bed, his breathing deep and regular. For the first time in a long time, Lucy felt safe enough to close her eyes without fear of what might happen while she slept. But the safety was too new, too fragile. And with it came questions the girl didn't know how to answer. What would happen tomorrow? And after that? Was this real or just a dream she would soon wake up from? What if Al found her? What if everything went back to the way it was before? She turned over in bed, hugging the pillow. A tear rolled down her face, then another, and soon she was crying silently. They weren't tears of fear, at least not only that. They were tears of relief, the kind that come when the body finally understands that it can let its guard down, that it can rest, that it can feel. Thor sensed it. Even asleep, his protective instinct woke him. He lifted his head, watched the girl crying, and then did something no working dog should ever do. He got on the bed. He lay down beside Lucy, big and warm, a solid presence that said without words, "I'm here, you're not alone." Lucy hugged the dog, burying her face in his soft fur. And there, protected by that unlikely guardian, she finally fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Arthur woke up early as usual, but this time not out of habit, but with purpose. He made coffee, prepared toast with melted cheese, and cut up some fruit. He was setting the table when Lucy appeared in the kitchen, still in borrowed pajamas that were too big for her hair disheveled and her eyes swollen from crying. "Good morning," Arthur said with a gentle smile. "Did you sleep well?" Lucy nodded shyly, not knowing exactly how to act. She sat at the table looking at the food as if it were a mirage. Thor lay at her feet, attentive. "Eat up, sweetheart. No need to rush or be afraid. No one's going to take food away from you here." The affectionate term, sweetheart, slipped out naturally without Arthur noticing. But Lucy noticed, and something inside her, something that had been curled up and wounded for so long, began to expand. It was like a flower finding a sliver of sunlight after months in the dark. They ate in comfortable silence. Afterward, Arthur took Lucy to see the workshop out back. He showed her the tools Madeline had loved to see him use, explained some unfinished projects, and let her touch the different woods and feel their textures. Lucy became fascinated with an old music box Arthur was fixing. When he opened it and the soft melody began to play, the girl's eyes lit up. It was the first time Arthur had seen her smile. A small, timid smile, but a real one. And in that moment, he knew he was doing the right thing. The days that followed were a period of adjustment. Raphael returned to Kingsport, but called daily to check on the situation. Dr. Fisher moved the legal proceedings forward, talking with CPS and gathering documentation. Beatrice Moore, the specialist lawyer, joined the team and began building a robust case to secure permanent custody. Meanwhile, Lucy was rediscovering what it meant to have a routine. She would wake up, have breakfast, help Arthur with small household chores, and play with Thor in the yard. In the afternoons, Carmen would visit and they would talk about various things, slowly building trust. Sometimes Lucy would draw. Her drawings were dark at first, full of grey figures and rain. But gradually colours began to appear. Yellow, green, blue. Thor remained Lucy's strongest link to this new reality. The dog accompanied her in everything, patient and protective. When she had nightmares and woke up scared, it was Thor who was there licking her hand, comforting her with his constant presence. One afternoon, Mrs. Gladys showed up with a bag full of clothes that had belonged to her granddaughters. She said they were just taking up space and that Lucy could have them. The girl shyly accepted. They were pretty, colourful clothes, normal girl clothes, for The first time she could choose what to wear. The news about Lucy's situation spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors brought food, toys, and words of support. Others, as always, just watched from a distance, judging in silence. But Arthur didn't care. He had a mission now, and nothing would deter him from it. Al, for his part, had disappeared. The police were looking for him, but he seemed to have fled after discovering that Lucy was under protection. This made things easier, but also left a sense of unfinished business. As long as he was free, there would always be a risk, however small. Dr. Fisher also managed to get information about Simone, the biological mother. She had been institutionalized for nearly 2 years in a public facility in Kingsport, diagnosed with schizophrenia. Her treatment was showing progress, but she was not yet in a condition to resume custody of her daughter. When she learned that Lucy was safe and being cared for by a family, Simone expressed relief. She said she only wanted what was best for the girl, even if it meant not being present at that moment. It was Carmen who mediated the first conversation between mother and daughter via video call. Lucy was nervous, trembling, but when she saw Simone's face on the screen, when she heard her voice say, "Sweetheart, I love you, I'm getting better," all the tension dissolved into tears. The two cried together, separated by miles but connected by a love that had never disappeared, only been temporarily obscured by the shadows of illness. Simone told Lucy to listen to Mr. Arthur, to study, to be happy. She promised that one day they would be together again, and Lucy for the first time allowed herself to believe it. That night, Arthur sat on the porch as he always did, but this time he wasn't alone. Lucy was beside him, drawing in a new notebook he had bought her. Thor was dozing at their feet, and for the first time in over a year, Arthur felt that the house was alive again, not in the same way as before. Madeline would never be replaced, but there was a new kind of life there, a life he had helped save, a life that was now saving him too. The weeks turned into a flowing stream, each day bringing small victories and unexpected challenges. Arthur discovered that caring for a traumatized child was infinitely more complex than he had imagined. It wasn't enough to offer food and shelter. Lucy needed structure, gentle boundaries, and patience when she woke up screaming in the middle of the night. She needed someone who was present not just physically but emotionally. And Arthur, who had spent over a year locked in his own pain, had to relearn how to connect with the world. Raphael was essential in this process. He came from Kingsport every weekend, bringing his granddaughter Isabella, a bright 7-year-old who quickly became a companion for Lucy. The two girls played in the yard under Thor's watchful eye, building imaginary castles and inventing stories where they always defeated the villains. It was comforting to see Lucy laughing, running, being a child. But it was also painful, because every moment of real joy highlighted how many such moments she had lost. Therapy began in the 3rd week. Dr. Helen Kavanagh, a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, saw Lucy twice a week at her office in downtown Oakstead. The sessions were difficult. Lucy resisted talking about the past, building invisible walls whenever the questions got too close to her deepest wounds. But Dr. Helen was patient. She used drawings, games, stories, and slowly, brick by brick, those walls began to show cracks. It was in one of these sessions that Lucy finally spoke about the notes. Not directly, but through a story she said she had invented about a girl named Maria. Maria had a friend named Anna, Lucy explained, and they both lived in the same house with a bad man. Anna was younger and suffered even more. One day, Anna asked Maria for help, and Maria wrote notes asking for help. But before anyone could find them, Anna disappeared. Maria never saw her again. Dr. Helen listened without interrupting, mentally noting every detail. When Lucy finished, the psychologist gently asked if Maria had been able to forgive herself for not being able to save Anna. Lucy was silent for a long time. Then, with tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "I don't know." It was a breakthrough. Maria's story was clearly Lucy's story, or at least part of it. And Anna was real. She had been real. A child who had passed through Al's house before Lucy, who had suffered, who had asked for help, and who then was simply no longer there. Lucy didn't know what had happened to her. Al had said that relatives had come to get her, But Lucy had never believed it, and the guilt of not having been able to do anything was eating her up inside. Dr. Helen immediately communicated this revelation to Dr. Fisher and the social worker. The situation took on a new dimension of urgency. If there really was another missing child, this was not just a case of abuse, but potentially something much more serious. The police intensified the search for Al and began investigating child disappearances in Oakstead and the surrounding area over the past few years. When Arthur found out, his stomach turned. He held Lucy in his arms and told her, his voice choked with emotion, that nothing that had happened was her fault, that she was just a child, that she had no power to change what adults did, that she had been brave to survive, that he was proud of her. They were the first words of genuine affirmation Lucy had heard in years, and they planted deep seeds in her wounded heart. Meanwhile, the custody process moved forward. Beatrice Moore, the lawyer, had managed to gather robust documentation, statements from neighbors, medical reports describing Lucy's injuries, psychological evaluations, records of neglect. Al's absence worked in their favor, but it also complicated things, as he could not be officially served or defend himself. The preliminary hearing was set for a Wednesday morning. Arthur was nervous, wearing the suit he hadn't worn since Madeline's funeral. Lucy would stay home with Carmen and Thor during the hearing, but her presence was felt in every argument, in every document presented. The judge was a middle-aged man named Henry Taylor, known for being strict but fair. He listened attentively to Beatrice's arguments, examined the evidence and asked precise questions. On the other side, a public defender appointed to represent Al's interests, even in his absence, tried to argue that the situation was being exaggerated, that there was no conclusive proof of intentional abuse. But the evidence spoke for itself. The documented bruises, the desperate notes, the testimony of Thor, which, although it could not be officially presented, had been crucial in discovering the buried evidence, and most importantly, Lucy's own account, recorded on video with all legal protocols respected, where she described, in painful detail, what she had lived through. At the end of the hearing, which lasted almost 4 hours, the judge ruled to maintain Arthur's temporary custody of Lucy. Furthermore, he issued a warrant for Al's arrest for abuse, gross neglect, and suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of a minor. Permanent custody would be evaluated at a future hearing, after a period of adjustment and new psychosocial reports. When Arthur returned home and shared the news, Lucy didn't show much emotion. She seemed numb, processing everything at the slow pace of someone who doesn't allow themselves to believe in good things for fear of losing them. But that night, when Arthur went to say goodnight, she held his hand and said softly, "Thank you." It was the first time she had thanked him, and Arthur had to leave the room quickly so she wouldn't see him cry. The months that followed were a gradual transformation. Lucy started school, enrolled in a grade appropriate for her age, but with special educational support due to her years of irregular schooling. It was difficult at first. She didn't know how to interact with other children, had trouble concentrating, and would panic when teachers raised their voices. But the school counselor, Ms. Marion, was sensitive and experienced. She created an individualized plan, involved the other students naturally, and slowly, Lucy began to fit in. Thor continued to be her pillar. Arthur had managed to get special permission for the dog to accompany her to the school gate every morning. It was a comforting ritual. Lucy would say goodbye to Thor, promise to be back soon, and the dog would stay there, watching her go inside, only returning home when she was completely out of sight. In the afternoon, when Lucy returned, Thor was always waiting in the same spot. His tail would wag furiously, and he would greet her as if she had been gone for years. It was unconditional love, the kind that demanded nothing but presence. Arthur was changing too. The house, once silent and heavy with grief, was now alive. It had drawings taped to the refrigerator, toys scattered around the living room, laughter echoing through the hallways. He had started using his workshop again, teaching Lucy how to sand wood, how to measure precisely, how to understand that creating something with your own hands was a form of magic. Together, they built a doghouse for Thor, painted Lucy's room in colors she chose, and refurbished the porch. Raphael brought Isabella over more often, and the cousins, as they began to call themselves, became inseparable. Isabella, extroverted and talkative, drew Lucy out of her shell. She taught her games, shared childhood secrets, and showed her that the world could be fun. And Lucy, slowly, learned to be light. There were, of course, difficult moments, persistent nightmares, anxiety attacks triggered by unexpected situations. Once, when a scrap collector passed by on the street with a cart similar to the one Lucy used to pull, she went into a state of shock. She froze, breathing rapidly, her eyes glazed over. Arthur hugged her, spoke softly, and waited for the internal storm to pass. Thor lay on her feet, anchoring her to the present. It took almost an hour for Lucy to come back to herself, but each crisis was followed by recovery, and each recovery made her a little stronger. The investigation into Anna, the girl from the notes, revealed a sad story with an unexpected ending. The police, after weeks of searching, discovered that Anna had indeed been removed from Al's house, but not for the reasons Lucy feared. A distant aunt living in Port City had heard about the situation through rumors and decided to intervene. She had managed to get custody of Anna and took her far away without telling anyone for fear of retaliation from Al. Anna was alive, attending school and receiving psychological treatment. When Dr. Helen told Lucy this, the girl cried for hours, but they were tears of relief. The weight of guilt she had carried, the terrible certainty that something horrible had happened to Anna, finally dissipated. She hadn't been able to save her friend, but her friend had been saved, and that was enough. Arthur and Raphael, with Dr. Fisher's help, managed to establish contact with Anna's aunt. After much discussion and assurances of safety, they arranged a meeting between the two girls. It would be on neutral ground, at Dr. Helen's office, with all necessary precautions. The day of the meeting was tense. Lucy was visibly nervous, changing her clothes 3 times, repeatedly asking if Anna would be mad at her. Arthur reassured her, promising that Anna would only be happy to see her again. When the two girls finally saw each other, time seemed to stand still. They stood there looking at one another, processing faces that memory had begun to erase. Then Anna took the first step. She ran and hugged Lucy tightly, and they both collapsed into tears. There were no words. They didn't need words. They were two survivors recognizing in each other the same pain, the same struggle, the same victory of still being alive. They talked for hours, reminiscing, healing old wounds through the simple act of being seen and understood. Anna told her about her new life in Port City, about the school she attended, about the therapy that was helping her. Lucy shared about Arthur, about Thor, about how she was relearning to trust, and when they said goodbye, they promised to keep in touch, to write letters, maybe to visit each other during school breaks. It was an important moment of closure. Lucy was no longer alone in her experience. There was someone who truly understood, who had lived through the same hell and come out on the other side. And if Anna could do it, so could she. Al was finally captured 3 months after he fled. He was hiding in a small town in the neighboring state, working under the table at a car wash. The arrest was quiet, without resistance. He seemed exhausted, defeated, aware that there was nowhere left to run. During interrogation, he admitted to some of the charges. He confessed to using Lucy for child labor, to being negligent and to hurting her in moments of anger. But he vehemently denied any involvement in any disappearance. He claimed he had always handed over the children he temporarily housed to relatives when they showed up. The story matched what had been discovered about Anna. Still, the crimes he admitted to were serious enough. He was indicted for abuse, exploitation of child labor, and aggravated neglect. He would await trial in jail. When Lucy learned of his capture, her first reaction was fear. Fear that he would come after her, that everything would go back to the way it was. Arthur held her hands and explained that Al was in jail, that he couldn't hurt her, that she was safe. Dr. Helen worked through this fear in their sessions, helping Lucy understand that the man who had terrified her no longer had power over her. Slowly, the fear was replaced by something more complex. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Lucy wasn't ready for that yet, maybe she never would be. But it was a kind of acceptance. Al was a broken man who had made terrible choices, and now he would pay for them. It didn't erase what had happened, but at least it brought a sense of justice. Life found its rhythm. Lucy excelled in art at school, creating vibrant paintings that her teacher said had soul. She made true friends, especially with a girl named Joanna who lived a few streets away. The two would spend entire afternoons drawing in Arthur's yard, with Thor lying in the shade watching over them. Arthur blossomed too. Late fatherhood had rejuvenated him in unexpected ways. He had started making plans again, thinking about the future. He completely renovated the house, turning it into a real home. And every night before going to sleep, he would visit Lucy's room to say goodnight. It was a sacred ritual, a moment of connection they both looked forward to. One evening, months after it had all begun, Lucy asked if she could call Arthur Grandpa. He was speechless. Then he smiled with tears in his eyes and said it would be an honor. And Lucy smiled too, that smile that now came more easily, more genuinely. Thor, lying at the foot of the bed, seemed to understand the importance of that moment. His tail wagged slowly, approving of the new configuration of this improvised but absolutely real family. Outside, Oakstead was still Oakstead. Dusty streets, relentless heat, hard lives struggling to survive. But inside that house in White Ridge, something precious was flourishing. It was still fragile, needed constant care, but it was real. It was hope transformed into daily life. It was love growing. In soil that had seemed barren, but in truth was just waiting for the right seeds. And those seeds had been planted by an old man who rediscovered his purpose, a trained dog who never forgot his mission, and a brave girl who refused to give up, even when all seemed lost. Together they proved that families are not always defined by blood. Sometimes they are built by choice, by compassion, by the kind of love that grows slowly but puts down deep roots. The kind that doesn't wither in the first storm, the kind that remains. Lucy's first full year in Arthur's house was marked by a date no one would forget, the day she first called him Grandpa. Arthur decided that date would become official, a kind of symbolic anniversary of their new life. They threw a small party in the backyard with Raphael, Isabella, Mrs. Gladys and a few of Lucy's friends from school. There was cornmeal cake, the recipe Madeline used to make, which Arthur tried to replicate with the help of a stained and yellowed recipe book. It wasn't perfect, but it tasted of love, and that's what mattered. Lucy blew out the candles and made a silent wish. When they asked what she wished for, she looked at Arthur, at Thor lying under the table, at the friends around her, and said, "I wished for this to never end." A brief, emotion-filled silence followed. Then Arthur pulled her into a tight hug and promised, "It won't, little one, this is forever." And he kept that promise day after day. The household routine settled into a harmonious dance of responsibilities and affection. Arthur woke early to make breakfast. Lucy helped him set the table, and Thor waited patiently for his food. Afterward, Arthur would walk Lucy to school with Thor always at his side, and use the mornings to run errands, chat with neighbors, and keep the house in order. In the afternoon, he would pick Lucy up, listen to her talk about her day, and help with her homework. At night, they would eat dinner together, watch a show on the old TV in the living room, and before bed, Arthur would go to her room for the sacred good-night ritual. It was simple. It was ordinary. And for both of them, it was absolutely extraordinary. School remained a challenge, but Lucy made consistent progress. Her grades improved, especially in art and English, subjects where she could express her creativity. Ms. Marion frequently commented on the girl's impressive evolution, not just academically, but emotionally. The Lucy who had arrived withdrawn and suspicious now participated in class, raised her hand to answer questions, and laughed with her classmates. Of course, there were setbacks. Once, during a group activity, a classmate playfully shouted, and Lucy panicked. She ran to the restroom, locked herself in a stall, and stayed there trembling until Ms. Marion could calm her down. But these episodes became less frequent, less intense. HEC. Body was learning that not every shout meant danger, that not every loud voice was a threat. Therapy with Dr. Helen remained crucial. Twice a week, religiously, Lucy talked about her fears, her memories, her dreams for the future. The psychologist used various techniques, from traditional talk therapy to art and movement therapies. Slowly, the deepest wounds began to scar over. They didn't disappear. They never would completely. But they stopped bleeding. Thor grew old alongside Lucy. His fur began to grey around his muzzle, his movements a little slower. But his love and dedication remained unchanged. He still followed her throughout the house, still slept on the floor beside her bed, still remained on alert whenever he sensed something unusual. He was the guardian who never took a day off, the friend who never failed. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything had begun, Raphael arrived with important news. Simone, Lucy's biological mother, had been discharged from the hospital. Her treatment at the psychiatric institution had shown consistent results. She was stable, properly medicated, living in a therapeutic group home in Kingsport, and working part-time at a sewing cooperative. The doctors believed she was ready to resume closer contact with her daughter. The news shook Lucy in contradictory ways. Part of her longed to see her mother again, to reconnect with the woman she had, despite everything, never stopped loving. But another part was afraid the illness would return, that she would have to leave Arthur and Thor, that everything would change again. Dr. Helen worked through these conflicting emotions with delicacy. She explained that love isn't exclusive, that loving her mother didn't mean abandoning her grandfather, that it was possible to have both, that a family could expand instead of contract, and that, no matter what happened, Lucy was not alone. She had a support network, people who cared, who would fight for her. The first in-person meeting between Simone and Lucy was carefully planned. It took place in a park in Kingsport, with Dr. Helen present, along with a social worker assigned to the case. Arthur drove Lucy, holding her hand the entire way. Thor stayed home for the first time, and Lucy missed him as if she had left a part of herself behind. When Simone appeared, walking slowly down the park's stone path, Lucy froze. The woman before her looked like the mother. She remembered, but different too. Thinner, with shorter hair, her eyes carrying the weight of invisible battles. But the smile, that trembling, hopeful smile, was exactly as Lucy remembered it. "Mom," Lucy whispered, and the word came out like a prayer. "My daughter," Simone replied, opening her arms. They embraced, and the lost time seemed to condense into that single moment. 2 years of separation, of suffering, of healing, all mixed together in tears that soaked each other's shoulders. Arthur watched from a distance, his own eyes misty, knowing this was necessary but fearing he would lose the girl who had become his reason for living. But Lucy didn't forget him. After long minutes in her mother's arms, she let go and called Arthur over. She introduced him to Simone with pride in her voice. "This is my grandpa Arthur. He saved me. He gave me a home. He's my family too." Simone looked at Arthur with grateful, emotional eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for taking care of my girl when I couldn't. Thank you for loving her." Arthur just nodded, not trusting his own voice to reply. That first meeting paved the way for others. Bi-weekly visits were established, always supervised, always respecting Lucy's pace. Simone and Arthur, 2 adults with nothing in common but their love for the same child, began to build a kind of partnership. It wasn't easy. There were natural jealousies, insecurities, discomforts, but they both put Lucy first, and that made everything possible. Gradually, the visits became longer, more natural. Simone started picking Lucy up on some Saturdays, taking her for outings in Kingsport, to the movies, to museums. She always brought her back at the end of the day, respecting the agreement, and she always thanked Arthur for his patience, his generosity, for sharing what many would have considered exclusively his. The legal issue of custody resolved itself over time. Simone, demonstrating consistent progress in her recovery, filed for shared custody. Beatrice Moore worked hard to ensure everyone's rights were respected, especially Lucy's. After months of evaluations, hearings, and negotiations, they reached an agreement that surprised everyone with its wisdom. Lucy would live primarily with Arthur in Oakstead, where she had her school, her friends, her established routine, but she would spend holidays and some weekends with Simone in Kingsport, gradually rebuilding that maternal bond. It was a non-traditional solution, but it was what worked for this non-traditional family. Judge Henry Taylor, in approving the agreement, commented that he rarely saw a case resolved with such emotional maturity from all parties involved. He congratulated Simone on her courage to put her daughter's needs above her own desire to have her full time. He praised Arthur for his willingness to share love, rather than monopolize it. And above all, he acknowledged Lucy's incredible resilience, who, despite everything she had suffered, maintained the capacity to love, to trust, to open herself to new possibilities. Thor lived to see this complete transformation, but time, relentless, took its toll. At 13, old for a large breed dog, Thor began to have health problems. The hip dysplasia that had retired him from the police force worsened, making his movements painful. He could no longer walk Lucy to the school gate. He would lie in the yard, watching her leave from a distance, his tail still wagging in farewell, but his body no longer cooperating. Arthur took him to the vet several times. Medications were adjusted. Canine physical therapy was attempted. But the unavoidable truth was that Thor was nearing the end of his journey. The veterinarian, a kind man named Dr. August, suggested they start preparing themselves emotionally. Lucy didn't want to hear it. Thor was eternal in her mind, indestructible, always there. The thought of losing him was unbearable. But Arthur, who had already been through the process of losing a loved one, knew that some goodbyes were inevitable, and that true love also meant letting go when the time was right. One Sunday morning, Thor didn't get up. Lucy found him lying in his favorite spot in the yard, under the shade of the mango tree that Madeline had planted years ago. His eyes were still open, still alert, but his body seemed too heavy to move. "Grandpa," she called, her voice breaking with panic. "Something's wrong with Thor." Arthur came running. He knelt beside the dog, touching his head gently. Thor looked at him with those amber eyes that had seen so much, understood so much, and Arthur knew. It was time. He called Dr. August, who came immediately. After a careful examination, he confirmed what Arthur already knew. Thor's organs were failing. There was nothing more to be done except ensure his final moments were comfortable and full of love. Lucy refused to leave Thor's side. She lay on the ground next to him, hugged his large body, and whispered in his ear all the things he had meant to her. "You saved me," she said between sobs. "You were the first one to really see me. You always knew when I needed you. You're my hero." Thor, with tremendous effort, licked her hand. It was his way of saying, "I know. I always knew. And I love you too." Raphael arrived with Isabella. Simone, having been informed, came from Kingsport. Mrs. Gladys appeared at the door, bringing flowers from her garden. Everyone wanted to say goodbye to the dog who, in so many ways, had been the catalyst for this story of redemption. When the moment came, Dr. August gently explained what would happen. It would be painless, peaceful, like falling asleep. Lucy, through her tears, asked to hold Thor until the end. Arthur supported her, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering strength. Thor departed surrounded by love. His eyes, which had always been alert, finally closed. His breathing, which had always been steady, ceased. And the warrior dog, the silent guardian, the unlikely hero, found his rest. The yard felt empty without him. The house grew quieter. Lucy cried for days, and Arthur cried with her. They buried Thor under the mango tree with a simple headstone that Raphael had ordered. It just said, "Thor, protector, friend, hero, always remembered." The pain of loss was intense, but different from the pain Arthur had felt losing Madeline. That had been a pain that threatened to consume him, that questioned the meaning of carrying on. This was a pain that, while it hurt deeply, also carried gratitude. Gratitude that Thor had existed, that he had fulfilled his mission with excellence, that he had planted seeds that would continue to grow even in his absence. Weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Lucy woke up and went out to the yard. She sat near Thor's headstone and remained there in silence. Arthur watched her from the porch, respecting her private moment of grief. But then she did something unexpected. She began to speak aloud, as if Thor could hear her. "Hi, Thor. I know you're not here anymore, but I think you can hear me somehow. I wanted to tell you that I'm okay. I still get sad sometimes. I still have nightmares. But I'm better, you know that, right? You always knew everything. She talked about school, about her friends, about her mom. And then, with a voice that was choked but firm, she said, "You did what you had to do. You protected me when I needed it most. You showed me that not everyone is bad, that there are still heroes in the world. Thank you for not giving up on me. I promise I'll take good care of Grandpa Arthur. He needs me now, like I needed you." Arthur had to hold back tears. He realized in that moment that Lucy was no longer the broken girl he had taken in. She was becoming someone strong, empathetic, capable of caring for others. Thor had taught her that by example, and now she would pass that lesson on. The months passed. Life continued its natural flow of joys and challenges. Lucy completed another year of school with excellent grades. Simone got a steady job and her own small but cozy apartment. The shared custody arrangement worked well, with flexibility on both sides. Arthur, now 70, kept the house in order and had discovered a new passion, teaching woodworking to kids in the neighborhood. He had turned his workshop into a community space where boys and girls learned a trade while listening to life stories. Raphael often commented on how his father had changed, how he seemed younger, more alive. And Arthur would laugh, saying he had discovered there was still much to do, much to give. That Madeleine would be proud. On Christmas Eve, 2.5 years after Lucy had first collapsed in the street, the entire family gathered at Arthur's house to celebrate. Raphael with his wife and Isabella, Simone bringing a homemade cake, Mrs. Gladys. With her sharp tongue and heart of gold, a few neighbors, Miss Marion, Dr. Helen, even Dr. Fisher showed up with his family. The house was full, noisy, alive, exactly as Madeleine would have liked it. After dinner, Arthur asked for everyone's attention. He was nervous, fidgeting with his hands, clearly preparing to say something important. Everyone fell silent, curious. "I wanted to thank all of you," he began, his voice trembling but firm. "A few years ago, I was lost. I thought my life had ended along with my wife's, that there was no more purpose, no more reason to go on. And then this girl appeared." He looked at Lucy, who was sitting beside him. "You saved me as much as I saved you. You gave me a reason to wake up, to fight, to live. You showed me that families can be built in the most unexpected ways. And you taught me that love, true love, is about choosing every day to be present, to be generous, to make room." He took a small wrapped gift that was hidden under the table and handed it to Lucy. "This is for you." Lucy opened it carefully. Inside was a heart-shaped pendant made of polished wood. On the back, engraved in Arthur's uneven handwriting, it said, "Lucy, my granddaughter, my heart." The tears came immediately. Lucy hugged Arthur with so much force he almost lost his balance. "I love you, Grandpa," she said. "I love you so much. I love you too, little one, more than words can say." In that moment, in that house full of people who cared, surrounded by a love won through pain but also through hope, Lucy finally understood something fundamental. She was home, not just physically but emotionally. She belonged here. She was cherished here. And no one ever again could take that away from her. Life would not be perfect. There would still be challenges, sorrows, difficult memories. But now she would face everything with a certainty she hadn't had before. She was not alone. She had a family that had chosen her, fought for her, and would love her unconditionally. And it had all started with a restless dog who knew how to recognize danger where others pretended not to see. With a lonely man who decided that compassion was more important than convenience. With a brave girl who refused to give up even when all seemed lost. Together, they proved that miracles don't have to be grand. Sometimes they are just small acts of kindness, accumulated day after day. They are hands reached out when someone is falling. They are hugs offered when words are not enough. They are conscious choices to see another person, to care, to act. And from these simple yet profound choices, the most beautiful stories of redemption can be born.